два, один!
An out-of-this-world phenomenon. The draw is now set for football's World Cup in Russia. Hello, I'm Artur Petrosyan, and this is The Heat. "32 teams will compete for the FIFA World Cup in Russia next June, marking the first time that country has hosted the popular event. According to FIFA, the 2014 competition was viewed by 3.2 billion people, with 1 billion tuning in for the final. In short, nearly half the world's population will watch at least some of the matches. At Friday's draw in Moscow, teams were divided into 8 groups. Brazil, with the most titles, is among the favorites. For more on what we can expect in next year's competition, let's get right to our panel. Elliot Ross has written extensively about football in Africa. He joins us from New York. With us from London is documentary filmmaker and football historian Jun Gubba. Jun Dong is a sport and culture commentator. He joins us from Beijing. And with us from Moscow, where he attended the draw, is football journalist Artur Petrosyan. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Artur, let me start with you. You were there at the draw today. It's a big event. Only happens once every 4 years. What did you make of these 8 groups? Are there any groups that we should be looking at very closely?
Hello everyone. Well, the event was really big, probably the biggest football event in the history of Russia. And not just by the number of policemen around Kremlin, but by the number of huge football stars that we had. And well, everyone from those who organized the event and ending with the great Gary Lineker were absolutely fabulous. And I think, well, there was a slight accident in the very beginning of the draw when Russian former football star Nikita Simonyan dropped a ball with Russia in it. Everyone immediately thought that it could be a bad omen for Russia ahead of the draw, but a few minutes later, everyone was happy with the draw results.
So there you have it. Someone literally dropped the ball at the draw. Jun Gubba, you've been covering these things for a long time. When you look at this draw, you know, we've often heard in the past, and of course we're talking to an audience around the world here, so some people might not understand this, but we've heard in the past of the so-called group of death. Do you see a group of death where there's so many good teams in one group that it's going to be difficult to see who drops out?
I think unlike most World Cups, there isn't really a standout group of death. The two groups that do stand out for me, from an interest point of view, particularly from a European perspective, is the Spanish group, where they're drawn against Portugal. They've also got Morocco and Iran. I think that's quite a strong group. And also the Argentina group against Iceland. Iceland are a team that excites me, the smallest nation, population-wise, ever to play in the World Cup. And I think they won't be a pushover for Argentina. So those are the two groups that I kind of target as being the ones to look out for. But I don't think there's really a standout group of death this time around.
Right, and John, what about England's chances? I mean, England last won the World Cup in 1966. I'm old enough or young enough to remember that final. Geoff Hurst there scoring that hat-trick. So England's in a group, the other big team in that group, powerful team, Belgium. What are England's chances this time around?
Like you all know, I just about remember that World Cup in '66. I was only 6 years old. All I remember really was being told that England had won and went out to play in the street. I think in recent times, England fans have been very disappointed over recent tournaments, and we've come to not expect anything special this time around. And perhaps that could be the thing that takes the pressure off this England team. I think Belgium, probably one of the outside teams, one of my outside tips to do well in this World Cup, possibly the best team never to win the World Cup. They've got some great players, and Eden Hazard and Romelu Lukaku from Manchester United, and Kevin De Bruyne. I think he's pushing to be one of the top players in the world, and I think this could be a big World Cup for him. So it's not going to be an easy group for England, but I think the pressure might not be quite as intense as it usually is for an England team.
Yeah, Kevin De Bruyne, of course, playing in the Premier League in England right now, playing for Manchester City. Let me go to Elliot in New York. Elliot, you've covered soccer, football extensively. Soccer in Africa. So we have 3 teams from Africa, Senegal, Tunisia and Nigeria, who will be in Russia next year. Which of these teams do you think is the most powerful, that's going to get through probably to the second round?
Well, I think Senegal would have a good chance, and they'll fancy their chances in Group H. There's none of the really highly fancied teams have been drawn into that. I think Poland are the #1 seed. But in addition to the teams that you've mentioned, there's also Egypt, who are in that group with Russia, and of course they have Mohamed Salah, perhaps the form player in the English Premier League right now.
And what are the players we should be looking for among the African teams? Because a lot of those players actually play in the European leagues, don't they?
They do. Well, you saw a couple of excellent African defenders playing in tonight's big match in the Italian league between Napoli and Juventus. Napoli with Koulibaly, the Senegalese central defender, and Juventus with Benatia, who will be one of the key figures for Morocco. Morocco are up against Spain and Portugal in that group, but they'll be a tough side to beat. Hervé Renard has a great deal of tournament experiences, and his teams are always extremely solid defensively.
Right. Let me bring in Paul. He is in Beijing. And Paul, you know, we have football, which is growing in popularity in China. In fact, you have backing from the highest levels of government to make this one of the biggest sports in China. It wants to be a force in world football. And you have a lot of players from other countries, foreign countries, playing in the Super League in China. How will this World Cup be looked at in China?
Well, once again, I think the Chinese fans like me, although in their millions, have to watch and follow the World Cup from a very far distance because they don't have a team from this country to get involved. That's already happening now next year for the 16th year, 4 editions after China made it into the World Cup for the only time back in 2002. But China's effort after returning to the international community started actually in 1981, narrowly missed the 1982 World Cup in Spain. So people like me starting watching the World Cup from Argentina back in 1978 have been following the World Cup from a very, very far distance. But you never worry about a very high interest and from this huge country. And based on my conversation with some IP developers, those digital media developers in China last night, they are so keen, and some people are afraid of falling behind to get some kind of copyrights to develop merchandise and other digital, opportunities from the World Cup in Russia. So China is really warming up for it, despite its disappointing, frustrated, disqualification from the World Cup finals.
And I guess, Paul, for China to really make its mark in football, in world football, it will one day hope to host a World Cup, wouldn't it?
Yeah, actually, right after China successfully hosted the Summer Olympics in 2008, the entire nation totally forgot about World Cup. And some people, by excusing, the national team's failure to be among the best in Asia, were strongly against the idea of ever hosting the World Cup before China could qualify by itself. From that point, I was strongly against this idea because I think hosting the World Cup is very different from demonstrating the prowess of your own national team. Some of the not so strong teams or countries in the world have very successfully hosted the World Cup before, and I think especially when people realized that the entire world economy was slumping into difficult times, I think China was kind of regretted for playing that role of allowing about a dozen Chinese cities other than Beijing and Shanghai to play a bigger role to generate more economic opportunities, especially in the service sector. So I think now with the new leadership in China, like Xi Jinping as a big soccer fan, I think the government is pretty determined not to miss the very next opportunity to play host.
All right, let me go back to Moscow to Artur. Artur, how important is this World Cup for Russia? it comes at a crucial time, not just for Russia, but for other countries in the world as well. When I'm looking at this politically right now, there's always an element of politics in these things. Russia has its differences with other countries, with the United States, with some of the countries of Europe, but this is a big showcase for the country, isn't it?
Well, that's right. It's not an easy time for Russia at the moment. And the next year is an election year, and we know what's been happening in the country recently. But I don't really think in any way it can influence the World Cup. Yes, we will have elections in March, but I think the chances are minimal that anything will change. The ruling party will stay the same. The man who rules the country will stay the same. Yes, the number of people who are not happy with what's happening in the country is growing, but it's not big enough to change anything yet. And we will probably have some protests, demonstrations, and all that, but there will be people beaten, detained, some will be taken to jail, but it won't be noticed, and it won't influence the preparations and the World Cup itself.
John, politics aside, this is an important, a huge international sporting festival that brings people together. It's the biggest sporting event in the world. And it's a big thing for fans as well. You know, not just the fans, of course, who go to these events, but those who watch it on television as well. And we remember in the last event, Iceland's fan, I just want to play a short excerpt from that very famous Viking chant that went around the world. Let's watch that. That was very unique. So looking at this event, it's going to be watched by billions of people across the world. What impact does it have beyond just what goes on the field?
I think when you get a World Cup, it very much is the greatest show on earth. And one of the standout things from the last major tournament, the European Championships, when Iceland and their fantastic fans and their great team spirit stood out when they took on and conquered England. I think one of the matches I'm really looking forward to is Argentina against Iceland, because it's going to be a fascinating clash between Argentina with their history and their passion and their amazing supporters, and this incredible story of Iceland and their supporters and their team, because it's going to be a great showpiece. And it's games like this which really do sell football, and I think it does really embrace the whole of society, because people who don't really follow football, when it comes to a World Cup, especially when you have teams like Iceland and Argentina and the passion of their fans, I think it's the passion of the fans which really cuts through, because at the end of the day, people forget about, you know, other things like politics and other problems outside football. And football does very much bring people together. And I think this Iceland versus Argentina game, and that's going to be one of the standout memories, I think, when we look back on this World Cup.
Yeah. Elliot, when we look at football in Africa, what kind of support is there for the game in Africa? Does it get the kind of priority that it should as a sporting event?
Absolutely. In fact, if you have to watch the World Cup anywhere apart from the host country, I'd say watching it in Africa is probably your best option. People go absolutely crazy for it, and not just actually for the senior World Cup, but for the age group level World Cups as well. You'll see, it's very common, you'll just be driving down a road somewhere and you'll see tens, sometimes hundreds of people around a television or in a viewing center. No, people are absolutely psyched for the World Cup. And the nice thing as well is that there tends to be good solidarity among African fans. So if one team drops out, then you just move on and support the next African team. And next year, certainly the hope will be that an African team can finally make it to the semi-finals.
Right. Paul, you know, we've been talking about China and the potential for football in China. I forgot to ask you what you think of the draw and the 32 teams that will be playing in Russia. Is there any team that stands out for you?
Well, not really. You know, the Iberian rivalry between Portugal and Spain, of course, catches much attention here based on my reading of very early morning reports on China's digital media. And I think a lot of Chinese fans would also be interested in Group G, where England has been grouped together with Belgium, with so many Belgian, very talented Belgian players playing in the Premiership. I think basically most Chinese fans, if they follow football or soccer, on a weekly basis, they would tend to follow those European and Latin American teams. You have very strong fan bases here for Argentina, Brazil, England, maybe Germany, and of course Spain. But will the Chinese fans follow those Asian teams? I'm not sure. Of course, they will be interested in the result of their overnight Beijing time battle against another team the next morning, how Japan or South Korea or Saudi Arabia actually fared overnight. But I think, maybe Japanese fans cheered for their relatively easier grouping with the group of Poland. But all the other teams have very, very tough challenges in their group. But I don't like the idea of a group of death, because when you have 4 teams, when you have 8 groups, normally our experience is, the most fiercely battled round group turn out to be not necessarily the previously thought that group of death.
Okay, we are going to have to take a break right now. More of our conversation when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.